Before we get into today's show, I just want to add a quick reminder that any donations given to our nonprofit, Better Burma, will be shared directly with those in Myanmar who need it most. Any and all donations will make such a difference right now. Go to insightmyanmar.org/donation if you would like to contribute, or stay tuned to the end of the episode and hear more options. With that, let's get into the show.
And welcome back. My guest today is a recurring guest, Mike Haack, that we already interviewed with regards to the Burma Bill and subsequently also the NDAA. And today we're going to be doing a follow-up episode on the recently announced and even more recently activated U.S. sanctions against the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, or MOGE. So, Mike, thank you for coming on and bringing this to our attention. And would you like to just give a brief explanation of yourself and your work for our audience?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you again. So I'm Mike. I live in Washington, D.C. And I've been sort of on and off doing solidarity work with Burma since 2002 when I first went to MESAT. And right now I'm working for something called Myanmar Policy Institute. Spent 2 years getting the Burma Act passed. Now that it's passed, have been mostly looking at things around that could be considered implementation, MOGE sanctions being part of that, but also through the long drudgery that is the appropriations process in the U.S. Congress. I've been spending a lot of time watching that because the U.S. passes laws and then later decides whether or not it's going to spend money on those laws. So it's quite a process. Anyway, so that's what I've been up to. Thanks for having me on the show.
Our pleasure. And yeah, definitely, like going back to when we were discussing the Burma Act and when we were looking at the NDAA provisions, I remember the frustration of having to wait very long periods of time to see whether Congress was actually going to do something, and whether the things that Congress talks about, making a certain amount of money available for a certain goal, is actually going to eventuate in terms of hard cash, or whether those are more theoretical spendings that may or may not trickle down. So I share the frustration, but I'm looking at this article that you've written, this opinion piece that you've written for Frontier Myanmar, and it's entitled "New U.S. Sanctions on MOGE, Hitting the Generals Where It Hurts?" ? So let's talk about that question mark. First and foremost, what actually do these sanctions provide for?
Yeah, excellent question. So basically what they say is that U.S. entities cannot provide financial services to Myanmar oil and gas enterprises or any sort of subsequent entity. The MOGE can't just change their name and then get exempted. So what that means basically is that U.S. banks can't make loans, they can't make transfers to MOGE. That might sound like, okay, not that big a deal, But it is actually a pretty big deal. When you think about MOGE is the biggest source of foreign exchange for the Myanmar military, and the biggest trade, even today, to the best that we know. Most trade, even that the happens from Myanmar, and even that the Myanmar military itself is engaged in, happens in dollars, right? The dollar is a very, very important currency, and so by cutting this off, it it provides a hurdle um, to the Myanmar military to fund itself. It's not going to be a game-changing hurdle, and we can sort of get into why, but it does trip them up. So I think it's a good thing. It's a very good thing. I know the State Department has been thinking about this, looking at this, thinking very hard about this. They had to get the politics in line before it happened. We can talk about what I mean by that as well. But I think it's a big deal. The biggest deal with MOGE sanctions actually happened when the European Union sanctioned MOGE, which led to the Bank of China actually putting the money that would have gone to MOGE through the Shui, pipeline, and they put it into escrow. So the Myanmar military wasn't receiving that money. And that was the Bank of China complying with European Union sanctions because they're afraid of they didn't want to make the Europeans angry, basically, or have to transfer things through European banks. So it can have broad effects. The way these sanctions were written, though, the U.S. definitely wrote them with Thailand in mind, and to allow Thailand to sort of to punch as hard as we can toward the MOGE, but allow Thailand, PBT, POSCO, others but I think particularly Thailand was the concern here, to allow them to continue to get gas there from Myanmar. And unfortunately, that means that continue payments, but not in dollars. So it is significant.
So there's quite a lot here that I do want to sort of touch on because to you this may be very obvious, but I think to a lot of people, myself included, there are a lot of dimensions in what you've just said that are very, very significant. So the first thing that I want to look at is the state of Myanmar petrochemicals, because or fossil fuels, because we saw over a year ago the withdrawal of Chevron from the United States, Total from France, and Woodside from Australia. These were major fossil fuel extraction companies that were saying, hey, we're going to wind down our businesses. I think Total was the most aggressive. From memory, they said it's 6 months to dismantle. And, I reached out to a contact of mine who actually used to work for Chevron back before all of this. And he said, well, the thing is, the dismantling process is going to be very, very slow. And if what we're hearing from other analysts with regards to the amount of oil or gas available in the Yadana gas fields is true, what these companies may have been announcing is not actually a moral position. It was just them saying, well, the gas fields where we're currently operating are running dry, and we don't want to open up new operations to last for the next 10 years in a war-torn country. So with regards to the petrochemicals, was Myanmar really making that much of that industry in the immediate sort of precedents, like throughout 2022, 2023?
Well, I think yes. So the best that I've been able to get intelligence on this, like it continues to. The question is about in the years to come. You're right, there has been a dip, but my understanding is that hasn't been significant yet. I mean, I guess depends on what you mean by significant, but you're right that the gas fields are running dry, but the dramatic kind of drop off hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
Total did it. Total actually pulled out. It sold its shares. Um, Chevron has not. Like Chevron is still owns their shares uh, in the Yadana
Is
pipeline.
Chevron still in Myanmar? Like, are there Chevron
Yes,
employees in the country?
I don't know that, but they still own. You know, now it's actually the majority share, although PPT is the controlling owner, from what I understand. I don't understand
Okay.
why that is the arrangement, but um, the what happened is when Total pulled out, they sold their shares. They just split them proportionally between the other three owners, which is PPT, MOGE, and Chevron. Chevron then agreed to sell their shares to a Canadian company, um, but that deal has not gone through. It hasn't been finalized. So Chevron still has their shares,
Mm.
and they're still making money off the pipeline. Why it hasn't been finalized, I'm not sure, but it might partly have to do with the fact that it's an evolving regulatory environment, right? Like
Mm.
the U.S. sanctions. I think for a long time the U.S. has been sort of signaling that it was going to do these sanctions. Um, and I don't know if that complicated the deal or what, but yeah, Chevron's still in there.
But so just on this, like, uh, what we saw, a year ago or 2 years ago, within the actual fine print, not even all that fine actually, within the print of the Burma Act that
Yeah.
Congress was passing back and forth, and then later in the NDAA, there were these significant slices cut out to make provisions specifically for US companies, namely Chevron, to do business with MOGE. It almost feels like Congress was protecting MOGE in order to protect the interests of large US companies. But maybe that's just a very cynical view on
Yeah,
my part.
I would say, yeah. So it's not so black and white. I hear what you're saying. So it went back and forth. Like, the version of the Burma Act. So the many versions of the Burma Act passed the House of Representatives before the Senate finally agreed to one that was in the NDAA. So it's the backdrop here. The One of the versions that passed the House, the one that actually passed in a House version of the NDAA, it had very strong language about MOGE, and sanctioning it. But that language was watered down for the final version. And it's true. I mean, Chevron was lobbying against it for a certain period of time. Um, for much of when I was sort of banging my head against the wall with all these other grassroots people to try and get the Burma Act through the Congress, we heard from offices, Democrat and Republican, that Chevron or different organizations that work for Chevron had been lobbying against it or had been lobbying for an exemption, and the sort of tension between that and the people who said no, why would we give you an exemption, was one of the many tensions that slowed the bill down. Um, but at the end of the day, like the corporate lobby did eventually change their mind on this. They I got confirmation from various sources. They basically told state and treasury that they didn't mind if they sanctioned MOGE. I think partly for the reasons you're saying, like it's running dry anyway. It's a I think I'd hope at least reputational liability mattered. I mean, maybe they don't care what I say, but a bunch of Congress members like banging their fists about it. It's oil companies benefit a lot from their relationship with U.S. Congress,
Mm.
and the U.S. Security apparatuses around the world. So, and diplomatic cover, et cetera, et cetera. So, it does matter if a lot of Congress people are kind of yelling at them.
Mm.
And so I don't think this would have passed if basically like the corporate lobby hadn't just been like, okay, we don't care anymore, like do what you want. Um, but it's significant in that it trips up the regime in those small ways.
And so let's also talk. Another really important point that you brought up is the dollar. Now,
Yeah,
the military. We've had Sean Turnell on talking about the business practices of the military and how they
yeah,
literally own the printing presses and they make all this money, but they can only print Burmese chat,
right,
and the international community doesn't really like trading in that. So
sure,
so the military literally needs to acquire US dollars in order to purchase the weapons, the jet fuel, the bombs, the missiles, the helicopters, the jets, and all that. And you're saying that this industry is the primary source by which the Burmese military acquires US dollars. Is that correct?
but from what I understand, it's the like largest single source.
Okay. So this then is a very important question, right? Does sanctioning MOGE, even if it's not necessarily the biggest earner for the military as such,
Mm.
does sanctioning MOGE still play a significant role in limiting their access to the type of currency that they can use to buy additional sort of weapons and ammunition and things of that nature from their allies?
Yeah, it's gonna trip them up.
Okay, so you said trip them up a couple of times so far, right? Okay, okay,
What I mean
you
by that, that's a good question.
yeah.
I mean, yes, it's going to be harder for them to get dollars, and yes, that will be harder for them to buy the things that they need for weapons of war. Um, yes,
You sound like there's a but coming.
I mean it's not a but. It's just not. I don't think it's going to be enough that it's going to like tip the balance or anything like that. I mean, it's good that the U.S. is doing this. I think that the U.S. is. I think this was a very well thought out policy, and I have a lot of respect for the people who actually finally implemented it. Um, I just, it's hard because I spend like all day with activists and stuff, and
Mhm.
I always hear the like, aha, if we just did this, then the regime would fall or whatever. So I feel very cautious about speaking in that sort of hyperbole. I mean, this is a good step.
And look, and I definitely respect that. Like, accurate information, realistic information is much more valuable than feel good information.
Yeah,
And so understanding what this legislation and will not do is important. And so on that, um, so in the realm of reality, where we
yeah,
unfortunately have to live, the
yep,
US government saying we're going to sanction XYZ does not actually essentially stop its operations. Now, let's take an extreme, North Korea. In
yeah,
North Korea, you can sanction anything and anyone, and the state will get people to change their names. They will issue them new birth certificates. Companies will be dissolved. New companies will be created, and sanctions are routinely skirted.
mm,
On that sort of scale, from sanctions actually doing what they're intending to achieve, and sanctions doing nothing because they only apply to entities that can be readily dissolved and renamed, how bad is Myanmar?
that's an interesting question. I mean, I would say that this sanction is in the realm of like pretty serious. That it, especially when you at least compared to the other ones that we've dropped on Myanmar. Um, the MFTB sanctions, I think, also you know have blocked flow of dollars. Uh, and at least have caused people to have to change accounts and things like that. Um, from what I understand, the U.S. intelligence is following this, although I don't have access to that kind of information. I just kind of hear whispers.
Hmm.
And sometimes when I talk to the people who do talk to U.S. intelligence, I'm like, "Are you sure the source wasn't just this guy I also talked to?" And then they kind of turn red. So it's sort of a small world of
Yeah.
information out here, unfortunately. Um, but how serious are these sanctions? I mean, I think this is a serious step by the U.S. I don't think Burma is the top priority of the United States in the region, right? Like, I think our relationship with Thailand is much more important to the U.S. I'm not saying it should be or shouldn't be. I mean, and I think that's kind of colored this whole um, discussion the whole time, but also domestic interests. I mean, in the paper I talk about, or the article I talk about, when I was just came back from MESA. Everybody had been asking for sanctions, so I got involved in the boycotts. I actually, me and a few other students like led a boycott that ended with this major US company to stop sourcing from Burma. And then we lobbied for the sanctions. And, at that time, I didn't really know what all was happening behind the scenes. And at that time, a much earlier, Burma related piece of legislation was held up by Chevron, um, for these exact reasons. And at that point, they're able to kind of convince activists that, well, if Chevron is to pull out, the Chinese company would just take over. Nobody wants that. Blah 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 blah. Now, like understanding what I understand about geopolitics, like I don't think there was any way in hell like the U.S. I don't think Chevron would have thumbed its nose at the U.S. in that way by selling its shares to a Chinese company. Like it's like this
Mm,
sort of silly, but it was like that was like the kind of fear mongering that was used for everybody to be like, okay, whatever, let's not go after Chevron. And they let them go. And what they did is they went after like the most vulnerable people in Burma, basically. Like we ended up just having a blanket ban on apparel imports. At the time, apparel was quickly growing industry in Burma, and the U.S. was about 50% of Burma's apparel market. At that point, like the U.S. was still very rich compared to the rest of the world. The U.S. is still very rich compared to the rest of the world, but China hadn't really come into its own as a market, and other countries hadn't. So the U.S. share of the global apparel market was huge, and it was literally 50% of Burma's exports.
mm.
And so it was devastating when the U.S. put in those sanctions, and I played a role in that. I mean, like 80,000 people, or sorry, um, I can't even say that, but a lot of people lost their jobs, and they're
Yeah.
young women. And I don't think it really hurt the regime in any way, partly because the regime was really profiting. They're making quite a bit off the energy exports, which was like politically impossible to touch back then. So I think that just the way that the US has been willing to go after the energy sector, the way that, I mean, Chevron may have finally kind of just, shrugged its shoulders and said, okay, do what you want to Treasury and State. But the fact that it didn't come without pressure. I mean, the pressure was there, and the fact that the U.S. is willing to be a little bit rough on its own oil company, I think, is significant. I mean, it's very easy. There's a machine of sort of good information about. I learned the word semiotic loop recently where like people give good news from Burma, think tanks and sort of like a lot of people in the US like repeat it, and then it gets broadcast back into Burma, and it often doesn't mean all that much, like, and I
Yeah.
think even the 2003 sanctions were sort of like that. It was like this big fanfare, and then later we'd like ban the financial services, which was a big deal, but all it really did was like take a bunch of people's jobs and didn't in any way really hurt the regime's coffers. Like in this sense, like we are targeting, what is a significant revenue source for the regime, and it is it's not cost free for the population. I mean, I do think there'll be a slight bump in inflation, but it's not nearly as costly as these other sanctions were, and it's something that the U.S. can adjust as it goes. And so um, I don't know. I think it's the best of a lot of bad options that the U.S. had. Um, I don't know, and so I do think it's something to celebrate that it happened. It is definitely a result of grassroots pressure. Um,
I mean, you sound very hesitant to celebrate this, and when it comes to apparel sanctions, that's definitely something that I would like to look at because it's something that I did follow as it was happening, and then as it was quietly unhappening.
like in
Um,
2003.
no, no, not 2003. I mean post coup.
Yeah, right. When people are calling for it and then they sort of back
People are
off.
calling for
Yeah,
it. A lot of companies moved out of the country, and then a lot of
right.
countries quietly moved back in, and we
Yeah,
had calls from different groups. So that's the way that sanctions have generally been utilized, especially in the
yeah,
context of Myanmar and countries like it. I think it's an important story to cover. It's out of the scope of our discussion today, but it's an important story
for
to cover
sure.
because I think you're talking about semiotic loop. I just described that as everybody wants to feel informed, but nobody wants to do the amount of research necessary to actually be informed.
Totally.
And this creates a market for people to sell you simple narratives that make you feel good, but
Absolutely.
unfortunately that amplify bad decisions and bad understanding of circumstance, and it spirals.
Absolutely. And I would say especially, maybe not especially because things people know a lot about, they still make bad decisions about, but
Yeah,
like with something like Burma, which is sort of a low information environment, right? Like it just feels like that can be heightened at times, where you get a little bit of information, and big decisions are made on that. Yeah.
so I'm looking at the article that you've written,
Yeah.
and what I'm finding very interesting is, so number one, you're mentioning the relationship with the Thai government and the pressure
Yeah.
that the Thai are putting on this. Now, we had Guillaume on some time
Yeah.
ago to speak about the state of the Myanmar power grid,
Yeah.
which we've done twice, and I asked him, when is the system going to collapse? And he estimated that Myanmar electricity as a thing will probably collapse around 2030
Yeah.
because the gas that the Myanmar regime was hoping to utilize to expand their power grid with new gas power stations, a lot of that has preemptively been earmarked for export to Thailand. There's nothing that they can or they're willing to do about it. Even the military is not willing to renege on the deal with the Thai government. So how much are the Thai dependent on this?
I mean, that's a good question. People say, there's radically different numbers out there about it. Probably somewhere between 10 and 17%. Other people say Thailand's a net energy exporter. They don't really need it. They've already kind of figured out. I don't, I think the thing is like, and this is a prediction. It's not something that can be said for sure. So I understand why it's not at all reassuring for Thailand. But we tried to make the argument that Thailand could do essentially what China did, where they keep getting the the resources across the pipeline, but they don't pay anymore, and they blame the West.
Yeah,
Like, and that's sort of the best of all worlds. Like it's like, um, you know, Bank of China can say, "Hey, we're just complying with the EU sanctions,"
yeah,
but there's no reason for the regime to want to cut China's access, right? I mean, it's
yeah.
they, and so we tried to make the argument that Thailand could do the same thing. It if I was a Thai minister or something, I want to keep those factories along the Thai Burma border running. Um, would I be compelled by that? I don't know, but that was the argument that we tried to make.
And I think it's fair. And I think one other thing that you've written with regards to Thailand, which stood out to me, was that the a two-parter, right, which comes back to
Mm,
what we spoke about earlier with regards to currency. The Thai government wants to move away and start using baht in an international trade capacity, which
mm,
makes sense. It gives the currency prestige and stability and all that sort of stuff. But also moving away from what whether we're going to be sort of conspiratorial or whatever, what is commonly referred to as the petrodollar,
mm,
um, as the very much US heavily recommended standard for petrochemical trade, is an interesting move, but it means that if the Burmese regime is selling to the Thai, they're not receiving US currency as an influx. And in fact, what
yeah,
you say in the article here is that because the sanctions prohibit US entities from doing anything with MOGE, that also means that if the Thai government wanted to send U.S. currency to the junta in Myanmar in compensation, the U.S. financial institutions that would normally have to process those transactions are legally barred from doing so,
Yeah.
meaning that it's actually very likely, or it sounds based on what you've written in this Frontier Myanmar article, it's very likely that this will seriously slow the flow of U.S. currency to the junta. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it seriously slow, I think, is a good way to put it. Yeah.
Okay, so because you still sound very hesitant to celebrate, and again, I appreciate that you are not trying to
It might
oversell
just be my
something.
personality. I don't know. I just I think it's partly just where I'm situated in the Burma world these days. I I'm very, very hesitant to make some kind of giant, like, this is gonna
Mm,
crash the regime. Like an article basically saying that about something has come out like every week since the coup. You know what I
yeah,
mean? And everybody shares it and everybody celebrates, and like, and people take it, mostly it's ignored. You know, occasionally, like, I don't know, the Washington Post ran something A1 above the fold recently, basically to that tune about 1027. um I don't know. I'm just sort of like, I'm hesitant to get on that train. You know, like, I think it's good to push for the things that we're pushing. I'm glad that we're doing that pushing. Um, this will deny the regime, you know, current dollars, which is very important. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's sort of just my kind of the way I guess what you're part of the reason I'm reacting the way I'm reacting is that I want people to think it's good. I want people to understand, like, the politics about
mm,
how something like this happens, like what all is at stake. I mean, like, you have basically, like, grassroots in the US, pretty diverse coalition of people that includes, um, you know, the religious folk, like the Baptists particularly. You know, you have human rights groups, you have the influence of corporations over the U.S. government, and you have the U.S.'s concern about its allies, and all of those things kind of boil together to make a decision like this. Which I think I really want people to understand that those are different inputs into the U.S. system. That's how we make decisions. Now I'm speaking as if I'm the sovereign,
yeah,
which I'm not. I'm just a guy. But you know, that's how the United States government makes decisions.
mm,
It's multifaceted. And yeah, so I think this is big. I mean, the they're still going to find ways to get dollars. They're still going to find ways to, you know, fund themselves. But this is good. I mean, I also I've been sort of talking to folk and thinking a little bit that I do think the regime, whereas in the 90s and early 2000s, especially, you know, after the sort of the apparel boom was crushed. I mean, it a lot of the foreign exchange came from, and it's still a lot still comes from. It's just the regime is a little bit more diversified than it used to be, in terms of trade. But I do think this is extremely important. So I don't know. Yeah, sorry. I guess I should sound more enthusiastic. I'm enthusiastic, but I worry about what the enthusiasm from the United States does when you think about this sort of like semiotic loop,
mm.
and I just worry about that.
I mean, look, I'm enthusiastic. I think we here at Inside Myanmar are enthusiastic lately,
Yeah,
because we've had, a slew of people coming in talking about the massive successes of and subsequent to Operation 1027, which you do mention in your article, and you are much more, I think, conservative in your outlook. Um, and I respect that. Like, no one can predict the future.
yeah,
But we've been looking at an uptick of positive news, and the important thing here is that the uptick of positive news has largely been internal to Myanmar. It has not been dependent on the aid or the goodwill of foreign nations. But this definitely feels like this is a really nice little Christmas gift almost, because for all of the uncertainty, what it sounds like you've ultimately said to me here today is that MOGE is one of, if not the largest sources of foreign currency for the junta. It has been sanctioned by the European Union. It has now been sanctioned by the United States. And corollary to that, the ability to convert gas not just into an internationally sellable, exportable product, but to convert it into US dollars in particular has additionally been hindered, because even sales to third-party countries now are going to have to work through more layers to turn into US dollars. And considering what other people have been telling us, that the military desperately needs to get helicopters, jet fuel, replacement parts, things like that, all of which would be sold in US dollars, or most easily sold in US dollars. It seems like this is a very significant step that is going to, it's hamstringing the military at the worst possible time for the military to face yet another issue. Like, they're losing on all fronts, and now they've just been cut off from a lot of the US currency that they depend on. Like, I understand and I respect that you want to be realistic, and that you want to be moderated, and that you don't want to oversell something, and you don't want to give people false hope. And I think that's a wonderful approach to take, a very professional approach. But it really seems to me, everything that you've said today is just saying the generals have woken up, seen this news, and just started probably crying quietly in the corner. Would that be a fair picture to paint?
I think probably that this was anticipated. I don't know for a fact.
So they would have known this is coming.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. has been talking about it it's talking about it before the coup.
But the U.S. talks a lot.
Sure, the U.S. talks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, they're moving things around. I mean, I think it's bad. It's another headache for the generals.
Okay. I think it's a very sober look at this issue, and definitely, look, you've written this article. I think it's a very well written article, very accessible. You don't load it full of highly complicated legalistic and economic terminology. So I would recommend to all of our listeners to check this article. We'll add a link to the article below, but if you want to search for it, it's new US sanctions on MOGE hitting the generals where it hurts.
I mean, one thing I've been thinking a lot about is, like, and this is not actually related, but I think the big question about Myanmar that's never addressed, there's never been addressed to me in a way that I find satisfactory, is what exactly does ethnic federalism look like? And if the end goal of the revolution is an ethnically federated state, and things like the democracy charter say that includes, like, regulating internal migration and things like that, like, how exactly are all of these identities that are going to be related to states going to be policed? And where in the world, be it northern India, northeastern India, or South Africa during the Bantustans, or other experiments with this sort of ethnicized, state making, like, where has that been successful and satisfactory, and where has it led to a lasting peace?
Many listeners know that in addition to running these podcast episodes, we also run a nonprofit, Better Burma, which carries out humanitarian projects across Myanmar. While we regularly post about current needs and proposals from groups on the ground, we also handle emergency requests, often in matters that are quite literally life or death. When those urgent requests come in, we have no time to conduct targeted fundraisers, as these funds are often needed within hours. So please consider helping us to maintain this emergency fund. We want to stress that literally any amount you can give allows us to respond more flexibly and effectively when disaster strikes. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam